Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Welcome
Hi,
all
Vicky.
to the Decolonize That, episode 2 of our 5-part series that we are calling Interventions. And let's hope we make some interventions. So we are here today, and it's a kind of a heavy topic with no comic relief, except maybe Greg, the music will cheer us up at the end. If people stay till the end. So last week, Greg and I decided we should do a little recap of the things. I don't know, Greg. What do you think? I think it's a good way to synthesize. Yeah.
Yeah, we can go over what we talked about last week, and I think it would be a nice transition for those of you who missed this great conversation. Like you get a chance to hear a snippet.
Yeah. So Varia, who is in the back end, thank you so much for helping us. If you can just play a quick video, and then Greg and I will catch people up.
There all along. So for me, the title of this particular intervention is not a joke, because I constantly say Black women were there, African were there. We were always there, yeah? And in fact, in the beginning, there was the Black woman, not even Black feminism or African feminism. In the beginning, there were Black women.
For me, Black feminism is not like how we can put bridge and close a gap with decolonization. Black feminism is the aid of decolonization. We're just thinking about freedom, about how it means to not have a property of our body, our mind, of what we are in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of reproduction right, in terms of when you conceptualize, you coin term and concept like a reproduction right, how it's been to analyze how children have been took to generation of Black women under slavery in all the America, how colonial state sterilized Black women even today.
Wow, pretty strong words. Greg, do you want to start by talking about what Fania was saying, or either one?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of them. I mean, it's a good excerpt, I believe, because they both account for two related but different things. Why start with Black feminism? As Yolande was saying, well, Black women were always there. I mean, historically speaking, I think the struggles we talk about and the political, social, and variety, about sexuality, in colonized spaces, before some spaces were colonized. I mean, Black women were always doing this work. And part of what we're talking about is also reminding people that work was being done at times when historically speaking, those have been erased or sort of ignored on purpose, right? And then what Fania is saying is that they're also at the vanguard, right? Whatever we call decolonization implies sort of reverting a certain process, but it's not like people stopped fighting in the meantime. And so I like what she said, because, Yolande said that, it predates certain struggles, but then it's also ahead of those struggles, right? I mean, there's a way in which Black feminist work, Black women's struggle is, sort of always a model in this sense. So I thought those were really good, very good moments.
Yeah, I agree. And, I was thinking about these ghastly events unfolding in India with this gang rape of this Dalit woman, and the ways in which evidence is being overturned and her family is being bullied. And it's absolutely awful. And in a way, decolonization has such a specific timeline, and it's such a particular kind of beginning, and then now we've inherited some of that. But all of these struggles of oppression have been on the site of women's bodies, women's rights, and so on. So I think that was a good reminder, and I think there's not as much written or discussed about it as I had actually imagined. So I'm glad we went there. We instinctively went there, and I think both Fania and Yolande really kind of brought it home in many ways, and I'm glad for it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was great way to show that we're also talking about work at the confluence of activism and theory, if you will, right? We all are, involved in academic circles, but Yolande and Fania also show that this, and that's also very much, I think, not exclusive, but certainly typical of women's struggle, right? That's always at the confluence. I want to say,
Yeah.
well, I mean, not always, but
there's
something essential there, at the confluence of activism and
yeah,
theory.
absolutely. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but part of some of the stuff Fania said, even on violence and the instrumentalization of violent organizing, and how you kind of, when you organize, you have to be ready for failure and disappointment, and it's just it's just kind of framework that decolonial thinking can really benefit from, and I'm glad we're going to move it even further today with queer theorists and folks who work on trans studies and queer studies and so on, but just for fun, Greg, bear with me. I was on Twitter, as we all live on social media these days, and I found somebody else decolonizing gender, and I thought it was pretty hilarious. Varid, did I send you the picture of it? Do you want to show us? Oh my God, there it is, and it's sponsored by Lululemon. Is there another one? This is a workshop to unveil historical erasure and resist capitalism, and it just got me thinking. One, and it's a sort of an Instagram influencer, and it just it just got me thinking about how buzzy the word has become, and then how we are surrounded now by this term, and we're surrounded by these kind of concepts, and they get co-opted very quickly. Lululemon, for those who don't know, are the epicenter of extremely expensive yoga pants. And the Lululemon founders, he has, yes, if you do yoga, you got to have the special pants, and you got to have lots of cash. And, my favorite thing about this decolonized gender thing is that one of the things that founder of Lululemon has said is that he has said one of the things he thinks women's bodies should be about is he promotes the thigh gap. Okay, so it's just really vulgar and hilarious. And I know, I don't know. Had you come across this?
I mean, I've heard of Lululemon. I was not aware of the promotion of the thigh gap. No, I mean, sadly, I don't know. Maybe it's not for me. Maybe I'm on the wrong side of the bear. I mean, I'm not sure. I like the idea that a big clothing company would fight against capitalism, I guess. It's a good thing to do. I mean, beyond this, and I don't know. Maybe it's a great workshop. Who knows?
It's on October 27th, and
so
if anybody shows up, there's some time. We're gonna find out.
I mean, to me, that maybe on the more. I mean, maybe it's too serious, but I mean, there's something about wondering and questioning what we do within certain institutions, right? I mean, Lululemon is sort of maybe an extreme institution, but I mean, okay, so the comment here makes sense, right? I mean, there's something about yoga practices, and certainly the way they're practiced in the in Western countries. I want to say that certainly deserves scrutiny. Is Lululemon workshop the best place to do it? I would not dare to answer the question, but I mean, I feel like something about the sort of multiplication. I mean, the fact that this has become a buzzword can't all be negative, if only for humor's sakes. But maybe it'll get people interested. I don't know. We might
have to agree to disagree, but we'll see. And I think when we do the episode called "No, It's Not in the Syllabus," we're going to talk a lot about faux diversity, faux decolonial initiatives. We know that universities are very good at talking the big talk. So anyway, this was just to kind of share, because I just I think it's just hilarious. And I agree with Shubha Xavier, who commented, we need to decolonize yoga too. And absolutely,
Maybe
So let's
we
move on to our guests. I see them waiting now. Maybe what? Greg?
Oh, no, I was wondering, maybe we can decolonize pants as we go about it.
Decolonize pants. Maybe the queer theorists can decolonize pants. All right. So we will get them in a second. Let's see some happy.
Hello.
Hey, welcome, Godfriend, Asante, and
Hello.
Debanuj,
Hi.
Dasgupta. Greg, do you want to introduce, say a little bit about Godfriend?
Yes. So I will introduce Godfriend. Godfriend Asante is an assistant professor of communication, difference, and disparities at San Diego State University. Godfriend has a PhD in intercultural communication from the University of New Mexico. His primary area of research includes queer postcolonial studies, intersectionality, transnational sexual politics, and Black identity politics. He has published essays in journals including the Howard Journal of Communications, Communication Theory, Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, and Women's Studies in Communication. He is currently researching the politics of empowerment rhetorics as they are used by LGBTQ-focused nonprofit organizations in Ghana. And given the pandemic, Godfriend is also investigating the long-term impact of the coronavirus pandemic on LGBTQ access to adequate healthcare, and given the association of non-normative sexuality and disease, and the effective economies that have emerged to sustain queer life in West Africa. Godfriend, welcome, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. I decided to introduce Debanuj because Debanuj is my dear, dear friend. And he is, he goes by he and she, and we can go either way. But when we speak in Hindi, we usually go by she, right? So Debanuj was my neighbor, and Debanuj was my colleague until Debanuj got a fabulous, fabulous job as assistant professor of feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Debanuj's research and teaching focuses on some really intense, rigorous, incredibly pertinent topics, such as the racialized regulation of space, immigration detention, queer migrations, and the global governance of migration, sexuality, and HIV. Debanuj identifies as Koti/genderqueer activist and scholar, and has an extensive CV that includes many, many articles, books, and grants. I'm not going to read them out. Debanuj has been working on a couple of book projects that are just absolutely fabulous, and I have come to know them quite well in the past few years. One is tentatively called Trans/Detention, the Politics of Trauma and Trans Migrant Justice, which looks at how transgender detainees and asylum seekers are subjected to trauma within detention centers and asylum courts in the United States, and how transgender immigrant rights activists are transforming trauma into a creative political action that seeks to disrupt the national security state. Yet another book that Debanuj has been traveling to several countries in Southeast Asia for, explores questions of how border conflicts between nation states in South Asia are felt at the scale of the transgender body. The book argues for a regional and interscalar understanding of transgender lives in South Asia. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry my bio can't do you justice, but I hope people will look it up. Welcome.
I should hire you as my PR agent.
Hey, I have so much free time all the time. as you know.
Sabbatical.
But exactly, I'm on sabbatical, and everybody is so jealous all the time. All my academic friends. Let's start with something. So Debanuj and Godfriend have been working on a special journal issue, or you both called it a symposium. And we had Greg and I had the opportunity to read the work you were doing and the data you were collecting and the research you were working towards. And one of the lines that, of course, was striking and immediately sort of hit us was this, and I'm quoting from this document: "Pandemics are not new to queer people, and neither is racialized and gendered violence." And I'm assuming that the violence here, the allusion here, is to HIV/AIDS, and that there is some sort of a haunting. And I remember talking to friends who even remembered that Anthony Fauci was active at that time. And I think, Greg, there was somebody else you mentioned as well.
Yeah, that's in relation to France. Professor Luc Montagnier, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV in the 80s, also, and he's fairly old and not really active, but he came out, in the news, I think back in May or June, with a pretty out there theory about, COVID being a mutation of the HIV virus, sort of designed in China. And again, it was a very, you can see how that made a splash. But in connection to what Bhakti was talking about, there's an interesting way in which, there are fairly regular references to HIV/AIDS, but you only hear certain kind of people talking about this, right? You hear scientists who are involved, by the, obviously because that is what they do for a living. But as far as I'm concerned, I haven't heard so much from the people who went through HIV/AIDS and, experienced it in ways that I would assume would be at least as interesting, if not much more interesting, to people currently. So yeah, I don't know if you could speak to this. It's sort of an expensive topic, I guess.
Oh, I'll defer to Godfriend. I'll defer to Godfriend on this one. I'll come in a little later.
Okay, so I'll probably start with the way that the pandemic has been sort of received or conceptualized in parts of West Africa. And also even especially in the United States, but we'll come to the United States later, not to center the United States again. But so thinking about this, I feel like in the context of Ghana specifically, pandemics are not necessarily that new to queer folks. Actually, the figure of the homosexual is typically seen to be willfully diseased. So there are other people who also even believe that the sex act itself, produces diseases. So when the figure of the homosexual and also being queer in parts of at least West Africa, it depends on where you are, but this idea is that you're already a disease. So you're already aware of that. And actually, I stole this phrase from Debanuj, so I'm gonna cite him verbally. Like you're aware of your biology and the precarity of your biology, and I think that relates to the notion that queer people have too much sex, they're having all the sex, and there's always this link to sex and disease. So I think that the consciousness of being sort of a walking, disease or almost disease is part of queer and trans consciousness. So I think that is sort of where we were trying to get to when we met by pandemics. Hasn't been, besides of course the linkage to HIV, but also the very symbolic and also the mindset or the general mindset. And actually recently there's been a lot of statements being made by different rabbis, very conservative rabbis, and also parts of Uganda and Ghana, of course, that is saying, and they're saying that the pandemic is homosexuality is what is causing the pandemic. So even evoking
gay marriage and homosexuals, yes.
Exactly. So I think that is sort of where we're trying to get to, and Debanuj can contribute to that as well if he wants to.
Yeah, and thanks, Godfried. I mean, I was thinking also along those lines. I think so. Right now I am in India, as Bhakti and Godfried and Gregory knows, and we also know right now India is sort of seeing the sedimentation, like a deeper level of sedimentation of very violent forms of Hindu right-wing Brahminical sort of identity and space and territorialization and re-territorialization. So in that context, I was rereading the founder of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, which is sort of one of the major bedrock Hindu rights organization. I was reading his biography, and Hedgewar, he apparently had bought these two hand fans. One of them had the image of Shivaji, who is this very famous, and Bhakti comes from this state, very famous king who defeated the Mughals, and so he's an icon, Muslim kings. Shivaji is a Hindu king, defeated Muslim kings. So he's an icon of like Hindu nation building. So one of his hand fans had Shivaji painted on it, and the other hand fan that he bought was Balagandharva, very famous theater actor, male actor who played female lead roles. Right. And he said he bought these two fans to remember that, what was the potential of the Hindu man in the Hindu nation, and what had the British made the Hindu man into an effeminate, figure, right? So I think the effeminate sort of figure, the effeminate man, the woman who is not attached to compulsory heterosexuality, marriage, reproduction is always a disease to the nation, right? And we see that in any forms of fascism that relies on this organismic theory of society, right? So, I mean, I wanted to kind of sort of think about disease, pandemic, and sort of the way femininity and the sort of belittling of different gender expressions are sort of already thought of as a disease, right? That I'm a disease for the nation state. I'm not the right kind of the man who will build the country, right? So there is that. And then there is also, I also want to decenter AIDS. I think when the pandemic was really big in New York City and all these deaths were happening, there was a lot of hearkening back of the HIV/AIDS, especially West Village, the sort of the memory of St. Vincent's and the temporary trucks as morgues around the West Village. But that spatialization of AIDS is precisely how whiteness and sort of Americanist queer theory kind of takes hold of our imagination. And then we see that being remapped onto the pandemic. Whereas for I think queer trans, persons in the global south, I think diseases, pandemics like malaria, dengue, Zika, any of those are like a huge part of our lives, and I think the disproportionate burden that any of these bring to the fact that many folks do not have access to good quality healthcare or even like drinking water supply, and on top of that, like being queer and trans really marginalizes you to sort of everyday forms of violence. When you go to collect water, some of the work that we have done in my water security project with colleagues, the stories from our trans community members is that when I go to stand in the line to collect water, people bash my head with the, water collecting buckets, because it's like the competition to get clean water, and let's get rid of this one person. Or if you are a family of 5, all 5 can stand with 1 bucket each, and your family has 5 buckets of water. But if you are a non-married single trans person, then you get only 1 bucket of water, right? So these forms of everyday violence and these forms of pandemics are like, very common to queer and trans, lives. And yes, and Godfriend and I are thinking through this, like how, like my access to my identity is made by making sense of diseases, right?
Right.
Whether or not I'm a risk for HIV, and now that I'm HIV positive, how I will give it or not to others, right? So whether I can give it, I mean, this whole conversation of asymptomatic is has we have already had it when it comes to STI and HIVs, right? So I think even coming to recon, like your identity is often through diseases, right? I mean, breast
Right.
cancer or other forms of cancer for lesbian women, not having access to proper health care or gender affirmation procedures or hormones or street hormones for trans folks. So the
Yeah.
very access to my body and identity is through the medical industrial complex.
Right. Thank you so much. That's so powerful, actually. But I had a very quick question that's sort of like, the answer might just be a simple yes or no, but media coverage of, I was in Nairobi when the pandemic, hit and the world sort of closed down, and at the time there was this kind of massive panic that Africa. I was being asked to evacuate by the U.S. Embassy, and I had to rush back, and all this kind of stuff. And the whole idea was there was a massive panic that Africa is going to be the worst hit, the worst hit, the worst hit. They have no resources, they have nothing. And then over time, some of that death wish, that kind of negativity around African representation still remained. But then there was these counter ideas, and the counter was Africans are used to pandemics. They've dealt with Ebola, and that they have a certain kind of mode of working through them that the West doesn't have. We should learn from them. Is there any analogous coverage like that with queer and trans communities where people are like, well, let's learn from them, or is it really more on the negative end of things?
Nobody's writing about queer or trans people in the pandemic. I mean, in mainstream media, like literally. And then if you try to collect data, like I work with geographers all the time, and my colleagues who are trying to map the pandemic, the data that is available right now, it's only broken down by gender. So you don't even know like the gender binary. So this re-spatialization of the binary, re-naturalization of the binary is happening in the middle of the pandemic, right? So, I mean, nobody really is bothering to, have any data around the epidemiology of the virus. Nobody really is thinking or paying attention to the fact that there were communities who already didn't have, like access to life-saving drugs, and that we were already like living within community care kind of overstressed networks, right?
Yeah.
And I write about trauma. There is so much trauma when you're just sort of struggling through community networks, right? But
so it's been totally ignored, you're saying?
I think
ignored.
Yeah, it's totally been. I think the queer sort of perspective, I mean, within the LGBTQ community, I mean, I know scholars, and I've seen good think pieces. There are a couple of reports of impact on pandemic on LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers that have come out from like UN bodies. But other than that, I really haven't seen any like sort of like mainstream media or anything writing about. No, I mean, not that I know of.
Yeah.
And I think that what they can learn actually from queer and trans folks is resilience, right? And thinking about the United States right now, even asking people to put on like a mask, that was a struggle for people to comply with the rules around COVID. And most of them were, things like there are reasons where, I need a haircut, or I need to, I cannot talk to my grandma next door. Like there is all of these things that I think queer and trans folks have endured for a while and have already formed, informal networks around that. So we already have the tools to deal with not having access to things. So I think part of what we can learn from the way queer and trans folks sort of form this identities, form their identities around resilience. How are they so resilient over time in the face of trauma and discrimination? I think we can learn a lot, but of course, we don't constitute their experience as as important, or even sometimes it's not even intelligible. So that is not necessarily incorporated into mainstream understanding of how we should think about resilience and also resistance to the pandemic as well.
Right.
I mean, I think that
one more thing too, I just want to quickly add there. Also, what I was thinking about is that, I mean, I was in an earlier, like in a Zoom support group earlier with the pandemic, and a friend of mine, a Black gay man living with HIV said, now maybe the world knows what it has always felt for me inside my body, like whether I'm a disease, and whether I can give it to others or not, it's like part of my consciousness, right? As an HIV positive person. So, and I think like this whole entire conversation around whether I can get it, whether, has somebody given it to me, whether I can give it to somebody, like these forms of like the everyday level of calculation around the being or becoming a disease vector is not new. I mean, that calculation, the basic mathematics is like, it's maybe now non-queer people get to feel like what it feels to do that mathematics all the time, right?
But then maybe not, right? Because I mean, I'm listening to you, and I have to. It occurred to me, we've seen, you've probably seen many videos of people, trying to enter supermarkets. And trying to argue, saying, well, I can't wear a mask because I have a condition, right? I mean, there's been hundreds of these, which strikes me as a really interesting way of entirely flipping what you were talking about, right? It's almost like, the pretense of, I'm not going to decide whether or not, it's real, but, I have opinions, I guess, but the sort of using, potential, health reasons as a weapon against, health, I don't know, against doing the right thing, right? But then it also makes me think of, President Trump's latest, rigmarole on the balcony and the videos that followed, where he sort of has this insane discourse of saying, well, I beat it, and if I beat, it's not that bad. I mean, this sort of when we know that he's still contagious, right? I mean, there's a way in which it's almost like all those things you mentioned are taken into account and immediately discarded, and so that evokes to me a point you make where you mentioned that the pandemic has been ascribed compulsory heterosexuality. And I wonder to what extent you see this at work in these examples and the many others we've seen of people pushing back not against the virus but against measures that would thwart the virus.
Right. Well, I can think of two big figures, and so earlier when the Indian pandemic response was the shutdown, right? There was a complete lockdown that was called in sort of late March onwards by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and I think the world shuddered at the covering, like the mainstream media also, like New York Times, everybody wrote about, and rightfully so, the plight of migrant workers, right? And that migrant workers were walking on highways, they were stranded in cities, and when the government arranged like for these special trains for them to go back to their hometowns, that they were really rendered kind of, homeless because nobody really wanted them in their home spaces, right? So, I mean, but, the images that you see of the migrant workers is, in the railway station, you see dead mothers and like a child crying next to a dead mother wanting food, right? Or the story of like, it's always around a family, right? The father and the mother and the children. But when And so where is the queer and trans worker here? There's a lot of trans and queer people who are migrant workers, right? And not only that, I mean, I just don't want to sort of, talk about the absence of queer people in this narrative, but also the imagination of labor as like the social reproduction and labor as value added, and therefore us only being like working people in the sense that we're homo economicus, whereas many people like are migrant workers because they're doing sex work. They're doing one kind of work that is not enough for them, so they're doing supplemental sex work, precarious sex work to sort of supplement their economy and their, income. And, where is the conversation around those figures? What happened when they went back home? And also, like, migrant workers are always known to live in non-family type formations, like groups of men, 5 or 7 men living together, groups of women living together and sharing food and income, right? And there was no coverage of these forms of what I would call queer formations, not in the sense of like, queer in the sense it's not heteronormative family unit, and there was no coverage of these forms of socialities in the coverage of migrant workers, the plight of migrant workers, right? So, and then what these kinds of imagery does is it bestows heterosexuality de facto in our imagination to the figure of the migrant worker, right? So it further erases the possibilities of thinking or, imagining the life of trans migrant workers, for instance, right? I mean, the stories that I'm working with, communities that I'm working with, a lot of Hijra and trans folks from Bangladesh cross over to West Bengal and work with Hijra gurus. These are group leaders, who are gurus. And then they go back often with some of their income. And when the border closings happened, and when many of the trans folks had come back to their hometowns, many of them came to, I'm working with Joy Shikdar, who's the director of an trans organization in Dhaka. Many of them first called her and said, we are walking and taking the bus somehow. Can we first come to Dhaka to your house, change our clothes, somehow acquire some men's clothing, and then go to our towns, to our parents' house, because they would be forced to live cisgender lives again, right? So this layer of gendered oppression that a trans worker, migrant worker faces is completely absent in this narrative, right? So, and I don't want to like diagnose the absence as in a theoretical way, like it really holds, like this worker will never get a relief check that a migrant worker might get, right? Because for them, they're trying not to be visible from the get-go in this whole process. So somehow just safely getting home rather than having their name on a record all over again and their family facing with the drama and with contact tracing, all of that. The other one is a funny one. I mean, I know some of you have children, but this whole like, the pandemic, I mean, has brought forefront the burden that, parents have of raising children, kids are home, and then the pods that are being formed are formed around children's activities, right? So this kind of the child as a figure of the future is back again in this conversation about the pandemic, whereas the bastard faggot who could hook up and might get the virus because he was just, she was just wanting to have sex or have some sense of intimacy, in the middle of this complete social isolation is again the perverse figure, right? It's the good parent who accidentally got it because the kids and their parents are they're already under burden. So even the measuring of the impact of the virus, the stimulus checks, they're all coming by the quantification of the family size, right? So that's precisely what I meant by the compulsory heterosexuality of the pandemic.
Yeah. Godfrey, did you have something about within the West African context that do you want to comment on? Or
my lipstick is kind of moving away. Sorry.
Very similar in some way to the West African context. So at least in the West African context, they don't shy away from sort of explicitly saying that they avow or they ascribe compulsory heterosexuality to the entire population. So because LGBT people are totally made or discoursed, or they're made invisible already. So it is almost a non-starter for some of these policymakers to even consider that there could be alternative networks. And I think that's very important to point out, that once you begin to incorporate queer and trans sort of ways of life, you realize that there's actually an alternative social network that exists parallel to these heteronormative formations. So in the context of West Africa, the government doesn't even want to even acknowledge that you exist. They will just pretend, especially in Ghana, where there is this sort of nonchalant attitudes like, okay, you're here, sure, I'm not going to chase you down, but I'm also not going to like give you your rights or anything. So you're just lingering. Whereas in other parts like Nigeria, where they're actually making policies to target LGBT folks. So in the context of Ghana, for instance, one of the I always hear like tracing. I think it's called contact tracing, where you're tracing someone who has been exposed, and some of these folks don't want to be contacted. So this is a very important way to, if you incorporated queer and trans sort of ways of life, it would click that, okay, how do we contact these folks? Should we let somebody who they're familiar with contact them, or actually a government official should be the one who's actually contacting these folks, or wondering, why are you contacting me? Also, in places like Uganda, where the government is actually using the pandemic as a pretext to arrest folks who are in safe houses, and saying, well, you're in this house altogether, and this could rather affect or increase the rise of the pandemic. So I'm going to arrest you all and put you all in the same, in a very enclosed place as well. So it does have an adverse effect when we do not consider the queer and trans ways of life, different form and the kinds of different relational formations that Debanuj talked about, that constitute or are part of this whole how we relate with each other. So I think it's important for us, of course, to critique compulsory heterosexuality. Not necessarily saying heterosexual, fine, but compulsory heterosexuality should be critiqued as a way of overturning and also bringing in queer and trans sort of alternative formations that is important to fighting this pandemic, actually.
And so much of the pandemic, containing the pandemic, as we know, is like a spatial strategy, right? Like sheltering, containment, right? Isolation. And none of that is, it's already a lot of trans folks, people of a non-upper caste, like non-Savarna, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi folks in India, people living in occupied regions of India, like Manipur, Kashmir, other parts of Northeast. These are military occupied, intensely, already burdened conflict, post-conflict or conflict-ridden socialities. With Kashmir, there are checkposts. So this form of spatiality, there's and this imagination of a home as the safe space, you stay in, you shelter, and you stay in. The home has not been a safe place for many women and queer folks. So there's some writing and consciousness around like domestic violence, which is very important work to happen. But I think there's some work that is now beginning to. I think we need to talk about intimate partner violence, and not just domestic partner violence, because it's the return. So this return to the gender binary is happening, right? Working women are needing to be housewives and mothers again, and then we are imagining male, female all over again. So this return to this gendered, spatialized binary is happening. For the way it works for trans folks is like, the access, the requirement, they need public space, right? In India and in South Asia, for some of the activities like blessing and begging and, dancing and performance or beauty parlors, all of that requires access to public space. And yet, we have always been like, there's been violence in public space. But now that space is shut down, right? That form of access to the space, like further containment of the space. So I think compulsory heterosexuality also means is like, how do we imagine the space and the containing, and who's home? Like, home is not safe for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only things I've seen, of course, regarding this is stories of very young, sometimes college students who, have to kind of return to the closet, because they have to go back, live with their parents and things like that. And I mean, if anything, the pandemic is proving again and again that the space of home is like heavily contested, heavily normative, heavily exclusionary. It's really for everyone at the end of the day. I wanted to ask a complicated question, which is the complication you have created in your symposium, but I wanted to just get a clarification on it. So in the description of this journal issue that you're working on, you are talking about discourse of development. We come from the global south, and we're very used to being from like underdeveloped country, developing world, third world, global south. All of these kind of are the terms that go back and forth. So, but I didn't fully understand, but in your description, you seem to be saying that the development industrial complex is, and this kind of way, this language of development is somehow impacting queer trans communities in particular ways. Maybe Godfriend, do you want to tell us a little, explain rather?
Right. Well, I will leave the explanation to Debanuj, but I also want to contribute a little bit there with because I have a lot to say about that. But so in the way that, for instance, I would maybe let me start this way. So part of my research currently is to think about local forms of empowerment, and empowerment has now become, before the pandemic, I would think, but even moving forward, I think it would even become more of a buzzword. So even though it's sort of, the term is sort of waning in the West, people talk about empowerment, but it's not as a big, sort of a topic. But in parts of West Africa, it is, especially to the LGBT community, because of the various laws and policies targeting them. The notion of empowerment actually gained a lot of attention, and it's of course advanced by international LGBT human rights organizations who are first of all looking for victims, and then of course trying to figure out a way to develop the victim. So I have been really pushing back on that idea to think about, when we say empowerment, there's always the assumption that this person has zero agency in some way, and as part of that, developmental framework is that this person is underdeveloped, this country is developing, so we've already positioned them as developing, as having less resources. And even connected, as an aside, connecting that to the pandemic, I was reading a BBC article recently that's talking about, wow, Africa is doing well because they don't have developed road systems. Their hospitals are.
Oh my gosh! I know which article you're talking about. They essentially said, Africans are eating dirt, and so they have such great immunity. It was so disgusting. And can I add very quickly, because I live in Nairobi, which is like the hub of NGOs and all these big international NGOs. And you say empowerment, which almost sounds nice, because I have heard people say giving voice to the voiceless, which to me, it's like an unacceptable phrase that is just thrown around, at parent, if I'm picking up my child at school and things like that. So anyway, sorry,
No,
didn't want to break your thought process.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And it's used, it's used in such a nonchalant way that I feel like you were saying earlier, it's losing its emancipatory potential in some form. But in the context, again, I feel like there's always this, you're already constructing them as, with no agency, they are voiceless. So this can help them. And we're not thinking about the local or the in some way how they have been resilient all this time. I mean, when you came, there was something working and something's not working. So how have they sort of survived all this time, and how do we amplify that? And I think also some of these other organizations do not want to talk about the structural issues. They tend to really want to focus on the individual and how do we, give them a job, or let's make sure they're dressing properly, or give them some clothes, or give them some shoes. And they're not willing to tackle the structural issues that are producing a lot of these, gross inequality across the board. So if there is already inequality, queer and trans folks are already sort of hanging in there in that overall structure. So I think part of that, especially in the context of Ghana, for instance, some of these international organizations, every time I'm part of a panel, I'm always telling them, well, make sure that we are also talking about, the mining company that is in our backyard, that is polluting the water, that is supposed to be in the community. And in that community, they're suffering, and now they're saying that homosexuals are the reason why they're suffering. So there's all of these interconnecting parts that we just cannot talk about empowering this individual to claim their rights from the state. And then just in your backyard, you have a mining company polluting your water. As if they don't necessarily need that, but they don't want to talk about that. So I think for me, development framework is very limited when they do not, first of all, talk about the other parts besides sexuality, and also when they do not partner with the local organizations, not in the sense that telling them, come on board and tell me what you need per se, but really sort of talking to people who are affected by their policies in some sense. So somehow you might have to bypass the NGOs because sometimes the NGO industrial complex is quite has now sort of become an issue as well.
And to add to that, so much of the NGO industrial complex when it comes to LGBTQ work, in South Asia, and I know in my conversations with Godfriend and other friends who are working in different countries and in African nations, is that so much of that came through HIV/AIDS funding, right? The ability to have like a drop-in shelter or a space where you could talk about sexual activities other than the missionary position was related to the targeted interventions, right? So you started off with talking about, other than reproductive sex, you started off by talking about any form of sex as a form of intervention, right? So the question, the conversation about pleasure is gone, in the developmental frame about talking about bodies and, sex and desire. And secondly, I think, in the context of our symposium, which, to clarify, will be out by 22 spring, correct? Yeah. So we wanted to be out.
Academia timelines don't even. I know, the world might be over by then. I mean, it's just
yes, but we wanted a longer term perspective because it's like it'll.
No, I'm not mocking you. Yeah,
I know, but timeline. You can mock me. The world does mock me.
Somebody recently told me and my co-writer that 2023 is when they could publish this article, and we're like, I don't even. Who knows what will happen then? It's too much.
Yeah,
but anyway, go.
Yeah. So it'll be out in 2022. But what we were talking about is the reason we thought asymptomatic as the title, and it's I think the title of this talk as well, is because like so much of the conversation around like diagnostic conversation of development, what are the signs of development, what are the signs of underdevelopment, how increased GDP increases in like life, infant mortality, reduction of infant mortality, right? Increase in lifespan, like happiness index. All of these are kind of these indexes is like part of the conversation of North and South, right? It's the very map. We get this map of North and South through these diagnoses, right? So it's like, what is the symptom of classifying a country as coming out of underdevelopment into development, coming out of the second world to the first world, third world to the second world, right? This entire ranking, this conversation in economic theories, world system theory, or these are some of the older theories, So we were drawing on that and doing a fun around like this sort of sphere of the asymptomatic carrier of the pandemic, right? So this remapping of these diagnostic conversations in the development industry, which is ultimately a colonialist trope, of disease, of intervening into the lives of the natives, and colonizing and saving them as well as taming them. So this remapping is happening in the context of the global South, right? I mean, rightfully so. The conversation around India is that it's a ticking bomb, and now the way India is represented is that I mean, of course, rightfully we have some of the second largest numbers of incidences, but the number of death rate, the death rate is lower. So there's this conversation, Indians deal with so many diseases, maybe that's why our body is capable of fighting this, right? Whereas there are some evidence of that the virus mutates and has different strains. And geographically, in different parts of the world, we have seen different strains over time. So there are different conversations that are getting mapped, and so North and South division is being remapped, and like bodies are being like replaced. Although the funny thing is, I had to come to India because I need to attend to my mother who's ill. And my friends here were like, oh my God, those of you who are coming from the third world, how is it like, because in New Delhi you had to go through screening. So for them, like the map is kind of reversed because, on Grindr, on this dating hookup app that I'm on, like people, men are asking me, oh, where are you from? And I said, I'm from New York, but now I live in California. And they're like, oh, how did you survive the onslaught in New York, right? Like, how was it when all these people were dying? So maybe that idea of where the third world is might have reversed a little bit, the kind of political drama we are seeing in the United States, many of us are quite used to in the global South. So maybe the US is joining the global South, finally. But,
in more ways than one, I think.
Right.
Recently.
Exactly.
I mean, that's this sort of a tone of outrage, in some of those pieces you mentioned, slow outrage from Europe and the US, and being how is this possible, right? I mean, I don't think I've read the BBC piece you mentioned, but I've read others that were sort of, sort of fishing for answers that would be satisfying to them as to why, the global South is doing better, right? They don't get it. But so, in relation to the title of this series and your topic, to go back to what Debanuj was saying, but do you see a way in which this, I mean, I don't want to say an opportunity, but that there are, circumstances of the pandemic might show us ways in which, queering and decolonizing those issues might, actually, bring in, again, maybe a political opportunity to do things differently. I mean, that's sort of where you were going, Debanuj. I guess you were partly joking, but then is it really just a joke?
I was also excited he said third world many times, because in decolonization, thinking, like we own that, it's still
Yes, yes.
it's still
Yeah.
cool, like the
Yeah.
third world solidarities, tricontinentalism, we want to bring it
And
back.
I
But
mean, and
anyway,
not to situate the United States as a bastion of like money, right? As we all know, there is gross equality within the United States, and I mean, there is a there was a rife movement of third world within TWW,
Yes.
and these are progressive labor Marxist feminists, from the 80s and 90s into the 2000s who had this third world coalition, right? I mean, in fact, the gay rights movement, so the radical elements of the gay rights movement, I mean, in the 1960s and the 70s, many of the drag queens, who were part of Stonewall, were part of labor movements. They were part of anti-war movements. We have to understand 1969, when the Stonewall was happening, at the same time, anti-Vietnam War protests were at its height. Students in Columbia University were out there, right? And isn't it a year before that MLK was murdered, and all those the riots and the burning down in Washington DC was happening. So I mean, we have to kind of think of to think of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, these figures, and the figure of Hatra, the figure of Dalit trans people who are being murdered on a regular basis in India, and the very rich Dalit, sort of Dalit Bahujan Adivasi movement that is happening in India. Like, I am an upper caste, upper class gender queer person, and my job right now is to listen to my Dalit queer Adivasi friends and to be in solidarity. And I think for me, decolonizing, I've been thinking of decolonizing and queering. Like, how can you decolonize queer? And then how can we be queering decolonizing? And so queering the pandemic for me, the other part is the queering the pandemic for me is, I think we have to talk about pleasure in the context of the pandemic. Because what the pandemic has done is, because it is so much around touch, around mouth, around kissing or not kissing, right? There are some of these stuff that the Dutch government had put out for safer sex activities. You can do glory holes. And I'm like, dude, I've been doing glory holes for a very long time in the sort of gay male leather community, right? I mean, wear masks or latex for sex. It's we have been doing that also for a long time. We can teach you how to have pleasure with full body latex cover, right? But I mean, really, I think taking risk, at the height of the HIV pandemic, queer folks were still trying to have, intimacy. We're still having sex. We're taking risks, right? So the conversations around, okay, if I have sex today, and then should I quarantine for 10 days, go get tested, and then I will meet other friends in social distancing. I think these forms of conversations are happening, and that we should not have these conversations with shame within the pandemic, right?
Right.
Because I think the question of pleasure and what is ethical pleasure? We were talking, this is very a pleasurable activity to do, right? And what if we were deciding to do this in person in the middle of the pandemic, right? So then would I or all of us not see people for 10 days, get tested and have dinner and do this conversation? And that gives us a sense of pleasure. And then after that, we have to quarantine again for 10 days in order to probably partake or practice another form of pleasure, right? So I think the question of pleasure really has to come back, because we are talking in econometrics terms, we are talking in epidemiological terms, we are talking waiting for the ethereal vaccine, but we are really forgetting that, we desire touch. It's really ultimately in the face of the other, the touch of the other, that I'm undone, as Judy B says, who I'm referring to here.
Godfrey, do you have you feel you agree with Debanuj, or do you have a kind of a different take on decolonizing queer, queering decolonial, and all these kind of
Absolutely.
mixes?
Absolutely. I mean, him and I have been going back and forth on this as well. And for me, decolonization is a form of decentering. Like there has to be a decentering. And I always use this example with my students sometimes when I say, every time I think about the grocery store, Walmart pops up in my head first. and then I have to go like, wait, why am I really thinking about Walmart? And I think for me, that sort of example shows what decentering might look like. That what pops in your head first when you are thinking about something. When you're thinking about this pandemic, which subject or which ideal person pops up in your head as a way to approach the pandemic. So I think that to a way to think about decentering which ideal person always sort of pops up. So for me, decolonization is always a notion of decentering the West, especially because it's so pervasive. Western ways of knowing is so pervasive. Very, very heteronormative ways of knowing are so pervasive across the world. Of course, through colonization, and actually, a scholar, Maria Lagunas, talks about even the gender system being a colonial system. So, and which has been transported across the world as well. So for me, this idea of decentralizing is important. It's very important for me when I think about decolonization. That wait, there should be an alternative. Why is the alternative never showing up? Also, so thinking about that for me is important. And also the queering part, is to think about the sort of ways to destabilize that binary in a very traditional sense of queering, right? Destabilizing binary. But also I think in very sort of praxis-oriented way, we can think about queering as paying attention to gender and sexuality and paying attention to the different forms under which it takes. So not just assuming, again, the default is to sort of rely on heteronormative networks and heteronormative kinship. So that means for queering, you want to sort of figure out, okay, who am I not paying attention to? Or why am I thinking this way? And sort of engaging in this self-reflexive process to figure out who are we excluding, who are we always including, as a way to think through the pandemic.
I'm going to add one more word to that, which is, decolonizing is also thinking about questions of transformation. How do you kind of produce transformation? Because it's one thing to kind of change the discourse or undergo some sort of a soul-searching thinking, but then actively one has to work towards transformation. I have a question here from Archa Banerjee, and we can read it together like we're in a class. It's a long question. Indian queer youth are suffering emotionally as well as physically during the ongoing pandemic. Whether they're coming out, remaining in the closet, they're facing several issues. I'm working with such youth as part of research on my community, and a lot of them seem to face terrible dilemmas where they don't know how to get out of such horrendous circumstances. They can't stay with their parents, they can't leave their homes. How can we help them? And this is so intense. And actually, when we were talking about this episode, we were talking about the kind of, what are the solutions? Like there's an immense pressure on care workers, So I don't know. Somebody wants to answer this question.
Well, I think one of the in Nepal, for instance, by around May or June, there were 700 documented suicides, during the pandemic, and one of them was like this very publicized. Couple of them were young trans men who committed suicide living in their houses, and they just couldn't take that anymore, right? And I think this is precisely that kind of pain, of everyday level cruddy kind of oppression that we have to think about in the pandemic. And to go back to what Godfriend has already said, is that there are, I know the same things that Archer is talking about that is happening in India, and people are living in overcrowded houses. There is always some one figure who might have some space or the door open, or people are making use of their WhatsApp data and sharing their phone data system and like sharing the SIMs so they have enough like airtime to be able to like talk with other people in the community, right? I think the role of memes and WhatsApp has been like really like we have to really rethink. I think those of you who are doing digital stuff really need to return to this moment and see what exactly the digital is doing for us in terms of life and death, right? Um, I mean, in terms of, I think, interventions, like, I think we really have to think about, like, if and when I want to go over to a friend's house because they're dealing with isolation and, deal with the precarity and create a support network, I am taking a risk. I am taking, and so some bodies cannot afford to have that calculation of whether if I get out, even with a mask, and like knock on my friend's door and try to get them out for a little bit, like these calculations is putting some people at risk. But my point is that I mean, not to make queer and trans lives as, I mean, a homogenized set of risky people, but that we are used to risk. Our life is always at risk, and we have made life through risk. Right? I'll repeat that again. That we are always at risk, and we have made life through risks. Right? And I think young queer people, aging queer people in this context are figuring out life through risks. And I don't want to kind of glorify it, but I want to tell the truth, right? And that interventions are happening. Like I am working with young queer trans activists in Manipur, like who are doing on the ground distribution of food and rice. One of the projects that Kumam Davidson, activist in Manipur, is doing is through their WhatsApp network, asking people to take pictures of what is safe or unsafe for them. Like, if you feel unsafe in the house, is there any part of the house that makes you feel safe? There's so many things that Kumam sent, inches of in the bathroom, that 5 minutes of taking shower is like my private space, right? So I think we have to think about that. Can I go back to one thing that Greg asked about, like what kind of transformation or intervention is possible now? And I think one big moment for those of us who are in queer and feminist studies or teach these kinds of material is to decolonize our syllabus. And we've heard a lot about that. But what it really means is to think that how queer studies is American studies. That queer studies emanates out of, the term emanates from Teresa Delortes and some of the big names. I love and work with them. Eve Sedgwick, Lisa Dugan, Tom Roach, Tim Dean, and even recently Queer of Color Critique. All of this is like very Americanist in thinking, right? And so the anti-normativity of queer studies needs to be decolonized, right? And if queer studies is about naming how systems of power relegate certain bodies as bodies marked for death or normative, that project is not new in the global South. I think feminist thinkers, Mrinalini Sinha, Sylvia Tamale, I'm thinking Maruna Murmu from India, they have been writing for the longest time what, caste, womanhood, and nation, means in the context of building this post-colonial, decolonial nation. So if the decolonialists were thinking about sex and gender, and what the queer studies people came and said, let's think about, anti-normative forms of pleasure and sexual identities. In somewhere in this trafficking, the decolonial queer theorist is lost. So the decolonial queer theory syllabus, literally, I start with Vidita Menon's essay about the body, where she talks about the creation of sex gender category as a colonial project, or thinking through queer stuff that is coming out of Asia, coming out of South Asia, like Dhiren Borisa, Niharika Banerjee, all of these scholars, Petrus Liu, I'm thinking of Howard Chiang, all of these scholars writing through Asia, right? And thinking about body and normative and scientific production and conversion of bodies into. So I think our syllabus really needs to reflect that. I mean, even if you look at some of the newest, hippest queer theory stuff that is coming out of in America, right? Wild. I shall not name the author, just to name one. Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, right? It's about, and while the author sort of is talking about how wild and like wildlife is always thought of as the opposite of the modern scientific, but it's a recuperative project that perhaps in wildness there is a radical queer disorder, but wild and forest has like a hugely Brahminical context in Indian Hinduism, right? The forest is a form of God. You live your 25 years of householder life, and then at your old age you go for Banaprastha. The forest is forceful relegated to indigenous people. So I don't see recuperating forest as a wild, radical potential. I mean, I do think forest needs to be recuperated.
Oh,
I
did he
think
freeze?
I think
I think
decolonizing queer studies. Can you guys hear me?
yes, now we can. Debanuj, I won't let you
Sorry
have the
about
last
that.
word about decolonizing the queer and queering the decolonial. Is somehow the syllabus is the place where we can do it, because Greg and I have been thinking so much about the limits of the syllabus, and you're going to have to come back in a couple of weeks to hear about that. But of course, I know exactly what you mean about how a lot of the queer theory is often American studies, and there's a big problem with that. But Godfriend, do you want to say one last quick comment before we move to Greg's, amazing musical moment, because we are out of time soon?
I think the last thing I want to point out quickly is, I think you asked the question earlier about the sort of pressure on activists, and I wanted to quickly point out that the activists that I tend to work with, especially those who work with NGOs, who typically the NGOs are individually run and managed. These are people who they're entrepreneurs in some sense. So and most of the time they actually use their own money, they use their own income, and and having to write for grants and working with people. So typically they work with me and I help them rewrite the grants or proposals as well. So I think part of the pressure here is that if they do not have access to other sources of income, especially with the pandemic, then the others also suffer because they're not in the right mindset to actually help others. So what, for instance, I did was, help. I did use GoFundMe account to ask people for money to support, especially those who are managing the NGOs, because they need to be in a mindset in order to help others.
Right.
So I think part of sometimes the difficult conversation is your financial support actually goes a long way, like $20, like $10. It does go a long way. It might seem quite trivial in the West, but for $10 for somebody it could help the person for like a week. So if you do have a chance to financially support, I think you should be able to. I think you should, at least for some of these NGOs as well.
Right, I know we get so cynical about these things, but you're so right, Godfriend. So playing with Debanuj's, we're bringing back Debanuj's ideas of pleasure and joy, and let's hope Greg has some pleasurable music. And thank you for this fabulous conversation. Let's listen
so much
now.
Thank you, all of you, and thank you, Godfrey. It's such an honor to think with you. Thank you, Greg and Bhakti.
But don't go just
welcome.
yet.
Don't go yet.
We're going to be talking about.
We're not going yet.
No, you have to listen to it. I think it connects to quite a few of the things we've talked about, actually.
Awesome.
So the first song here that I'd like to play, if you can show the okay. So I'll play it and then talk about it.
What happened? It's not playing? Oh. We can't hear it.
Oh, it's not working?
We can't hear.
Okay, let me try this. Okay, I'm not sure why this is not working. How about now?
Yo dis son virus qui pas joué, ouais. C'est maintenant qui vous veillez quoi, ouais. Faut laver, mais de temps en temps. Pas bailer, mais pas prendre la main. Big and bongo, faut des standing on bras. La personne y'a dit, il fait un pile de dégâts. Corona, il a fait un pile de dégâts. C'est mettre quoi qui veille, quoi, genre. Laver, mais on s'en mis de temps en temps.
You can't see the video here, but this is a song by Jean Roosevelt, who's a Haitian singer, has been making music since the early 2000s. Mixture of genres and beats from across the Black Atlantic. That's usually called chiaca. He has several albums, but this is a song he put out in May, specifically about coronavirus when the pandemic started. And this is something I've seen in other islands in the Caribbean and other places, usually in the global South, right, where famous musicians will put out songs that actually give you basics of distanciation and hygiene. You can see the video, but it's sort of all about avoid shaking hands, wash your hands, etc., etc. So an interesting connection to some of the conversations we had earlier. Also, it's set to the music of a recent big hit from France, Aya Nakamura's Jaja, for those of you who might have recognized it. So this is our first song here. Let's move on to Lebanon. Do you know them? Okay. Do you want to say something back to you?
No, I don't know. I don't know the song. I know this group, and I don't see the lead singer on there.
You were.
Did it disappear from the photo? It might be. Blame PowerPoint for this. But this is Mashru Leila, band from Lebanon. The song is Radio Romance from their latest album, The Beirut School. So they first got together in 2008, and they've gone pretty worldwide since then, from the indie Lebanese scene to a more international scene. They were on NPR. They've been all over the place. They're known for their eclectic style, but also for controversial lyrics about politics, society, and sexuality. So we're talking about pleasure, and Debanuj, you were saying talking about living dangerously. They've gotten in trouble, directly, or their fans, notably for waving the rainbow flag on stage and in the crowd at concerts in Jordan and Egypt, Lebanon. And
I could live dangerously with them. It's okay. They look dangerously stunning to me.
They are.
Maybe Bhakti can put you in touch. All right, the last one, I'll speak first and then play it. Last but not least, this is Gramo Suspect, Rainbow Ambassador Kenya, spoken word artist, rapper, and gay rights activist from Kenya. She's been performing since the early 2000s. First album in 2009 was focusing on denouncing state-sponsored violence, and it gained her the nickname Defender of the Citizens, which, and I will butcher this, but Mtetezi Waraya. She came out of the closet in 2012 and has been, the face of LGBTQIA activism in Kenya. She's faced a lot of harassment from authorities. Music's been banned from radio stations, but she's still putting music out there. And so we were talking about pleasure. I figured we'll end with a party song because, you know, we have to live in style, I guess. So this song is called Kuchu Party from our album Embrace Diversity that was really in the wake of a state ban on gay music videos. So this is out anyway.
Oh my God.
All right.
Ile bashi ya makutu watupu leo kuna cha supu ni bia tupu side to side wapenya huku na huku wamevaa hata nguo tupie ngatu nusu utadhani wako tupu tupu wengine jicho damu yani wako mandukulo cheki wanavyokaribishana watu wa full busu wakuna cha nusu cheki huku wakuju sister tu habu unafanya watu wafitukudu atu wanifanyani.
Nice.
Way to actually show videos.
Because it's a fun video, this one, actually, right? It's in the supermarket or something. I don't know. No.
No, it's a party.
Yeah.
It is a party. I was dancing. I did make a dance.
So thank you, everyone, for coming. Just a quick announcement. Next week, this time, same spot, we will decolonize journalism with Suchitra Vijayan and Parvez Bukhari, and with an intensive focus actually on Kashmir and, you know, the role of state propaganda, ways in which journalists take on the role of propagandists and so on. And so I hope to see all the people there. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Debanuj. Thank you so much, Godfriend. Good luck with your special journal issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Good night, everybody from India. Bye.
Bye.
Good morning.